Hi there and welcome everyone. My name is Kumutha Ramanathan. I'm a reporter with BNN Bloomberg. Of course, the pandemic has exposed so many shortcomings when it comes to supply chain management, and I report on a regular basis about a number of companies that struggle with this issue. And now, given sort of the heightened concerns around inflation and recession, we know this could really be the difference for a company to transcend the chaos or be left behind. Here to talk about some of the technology that can help with moving beyond the pandemic and all the woes that we've been facing. I'm joined by Jennifer Bisceglie. She's the founder and CEO of Interos, an AI-powered supply chain management platform, as well as Chakri Gottemukkala. He is the founder and CEO of O9 Solutions, a leading enterprise AI software platform. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Hello, how are you?
So let's kick it off talking about the human element in the wake of the pandemic. This is something that we didn't talk about sort of in the business vernacular until, of course, early 2020, when we saw a lot of society, a lot of countries being impacted by COVID as it started to really rear its ugly head. Tell me about what you were advising your clients. Jennifer, please.
Yep, so one, thank you all for coming back after lunch, so that's a good start.
Yes.
So about the human element. I think that when we think about, first, from an Interos standpoint, when we think about looking at the global supply chain and risk in the supply chain, it's all about transparency.
Yes.
So that's the first piece. The second is, to your point, if you think about what really changed, so many things changed during the pandemic, but from a supply chain standpoint, I kind of look at three things. The first is that the consumer base just spread out, right? So we all started working from home. So whereas you used to have things delivered to an office, everybody's at home, and not only that, but everybody moved. Pre-pandemic, my company was established and headquartered right outside of Washington, D.C. 98% of us were there. Post-pandemic, we're in 14 states, and only 42% of us are in D.C. So first, the consumer spread out. The second thing that happened is that the labor, the Great Resignation. So there was a lot of shifting of just skill sets, so availability of skilled labor changed. And then I think the third thing that really changed me, think about the human element, is the fact that the pandemic made us very empathetic in a way we've never been before. And so the competition for talent, not just availability of skilled labor, but competition for talent that believed in the company that they were working for, the values were the same around ESG and sustainability, entered the supply chain like it never had before. So I look at those three things and that kind of gets us going, but Chakra.
The human element in the supply chain. So first of all, even before the pandemic, so the supply chain has now become a mainstream word, right? You can't turn on the newspaper without reading supply chain. You can't turn on the TV without reading supply chain crisis. But before the pandemic as well, so that people have the context, supply chains are a pretty complex thing.
Yes.
We are drinking coffee, we are buying stuff from Walmart, we are buying, there's big planes being built. There's thousands and millions of moving parts that have to be synchronized across various things to get the product to the end consumer. You have to get the demand-supply balance correct. And global companies have been doing this for a long time. What the pandemic has done is just put shock after shock, right? And the recent, that's made supply chains so fragile. And that's why it's come up to the boardroom, and everyone is talking supply chain. So at a broad level, the human element, I would look at it as three things. When you talk to chief supply chain officers and CEOs, right? From the customer and the consumer side, all these companies are trying to, the key to managing the supply chain is understanding the demand, predicting the demand. Because if you get the demand-supply balance off, then you have customers who are upset, or you have too much product. And that has fundamentally, companies have to learn new skills. To Jennifer's point, consumers are shifting, where they're buying is shifting, how they're buying is shifting. When they come back from the pandemic, how they buy is shifting. So companies have had to learn to harvest new sources of data. How do I start predicting demand differently in this very dynamic environment? So that's number one. Companies have had to learn a host of new skills to understand the consumer and customer better. And there's a lot of technology required that you can leverage new sources of data to understand where consumers and how customers are behaving. And on the supply side, you read about the supply shocks, right? You have labor shortages, you have part shortages, and one after the other you're getting hit. So the question is, how do you respond to all those? And companies are having to learn that really great visibility across the supply chain, like what Jennifer's company does in terms of managing the risk across the supply chain, but then the ability to plan and manage different scenarios has become extremely important for management. You don't know what the future is going to be. No one knows exactly. Will inflation be faster? So companies have had to learn how to really evaluate different scenarios and be very agile in responding to those capabilities.
So let's apply what you both have just discussed to a real-world example. Elon Musk today talking about billions in potential losses for his factories because of supply chain issues, whether it be lithium for the batteries, whether it be labor shortages. Talk to me through how do you start to begin to assess a client's needs and help them sort of, walk through this process?
Okay. Yeah, so if I take industry by industry, right, so what Elon Musk is facing, every industry is facing,
Yes.
Retailers are facing that, big CPG companies, automotive companies, every industry is facing those challenges. There is huge financial impact. So it's a few key principles that need to be applied when we talk to the companies. First, as I said, it's about getting the demand-supply balance correct. So you really need to understand the demand picture better, which means companies are having to build capabilities to understand risks and opportunities in the supply chain much better than they were before. How do I get better consumer data? How do I get better customer data? How do I get better data about the market? Earlier on, people would be, if I'm a big consumer packaged goods company, like a Pepsi or a Frito-Lay or Anheuser-Busch or Starbucks, I would be forecasting demand based on what I'm shipping to my customer or my point of sale. But now I need to understand what are leading indicators of demand. How are store traffic changing based on COVID patterns? And
right.
So there's so many other things that people are having to figure out how to predict. And so we are really advising our companies on three things. How do you get better visibility across the end-to-end supply chain? Right? You have to get new data streams into the model. How do you become much more agile at planning and decision making? Because you cannot afford the slow decision making anymore. You have to bring sales and supply chain and suppliers and customers together. And then how do you drive a lot more automation? Because really, there's a lot of latency. If you don't respond fast enough in both decision making and execution, then a lot of value is lost. So all these are just accelerated, and that's what we're advising companies on how to do that faster now.
It's interesting because, Jennifer, you had just completed your Series B financing round for your business just as the pandemic had kicked off, right?
Yeah.
So I'm imagining you must have seen unprecedented demand as you specialize in risk management. Tell me, what was keeping the CEOs you were speaking to up at night?
Yeah, a single thing, and I think it really talks to what you just said, is transparency.
Yes.
Or the lack of it. And I think that that's really a lot of what you just went through, and back to the example you just brought. There is a realization, not an awakening, just a realization that CEOs can no longer do their job without having transparency of what's impacting their business from outside the business. We used to be so worried about just, executing within what we could control. And I think the pandemic really brought home that you can't control what's happening to other companies, but there is a ripple effect because we're all hyper-connected.
Right.
And so honestly, what's keeping folks awake at night is transparency. Do I have enough? Do I have it when I need it? When something else goes bump in the night, whether it's SolarWinds and a cyber breach, a ship goes sideways in a canal, the rolling shutdowns of the pandemic, sanctions against Russia. When these things happen, do I have the transparency that allows me to get the better data that you just outlined to make quicker and informed decisions based on what's happening at that minute?
So I want to challenge you both now. There are so many variables, as you mentioned, you can plan for, you can prepare for, but we are getting a growing consensus that the world economy could slow down. We could be facing a global recession. How do you prepare for that when we're already trying to get a hold on inflation and just basic minerals and resources being, in short supply?
Yeah, I think the fundamental realization has been that, if you don't have enough information and speed, in the past you could always buffer that with a lot of inventory and things in the supply chain. But now you cannot, no one knows the future exactly. All you can do is make assumptions, right? Is inflation going to really drive a recession? How fast? Will COVID, how can you predict whether China is going to shut down for a second COVID wave? There's so many shocks hitting the system that really there are 2 or 3 things. You have to increase the agility of your supply chain. You need to cut down lead times. People are looking at near-shoring the supply chain. Instead of having all the supply base in the Far East, every big company is saying, now how do I get a near-shored supply chain that is, and then that is, maybe in Latin America versus coming it all the way from the Far East every time. But then the second aspect is really the speed of scenario planning and decision making. People are realizing we cannot do, they need much better capabilities to do that almost in real time. What if the demand goes up by 100%? What if the demand goes down by 30%? How do I respond? So those kind of capabilities which were not there before have become paramount to companies to put in place.
That's great.
Yeah. I think, interestingly enough, it's really easy when you hear inflation and costs are going up in different industries to cost cut and to brace. And I don't know that we're seeing folks actually shrink. I mean, folks are double checking themselves, don't get me wrong. We've heard valuations going down and things like that. But this is almost an opportunity to double down on investments that make you pull out stronger, because you literally can't keep operating the way we have the last 2.5 years in this whack-a-mole reactive approach, which is where you go to your scenario planning. So there's 4 different areas we're seeing folks double down on investments for supply chain. The first is when you think about automation. Right, so when you think about shifting labor and having skilled labor, autonomous vehicles, drones, blackout factories, like what can we do with automation that make us more efficient and being able to get the right product to the right place at the right time? The second is around logistics, and I think that's a bit of what you're talking about, is how do I scenario plan my way out of this? So when things happen, I have alternatives that I've already figured out what the costs are, and I'm able to invest in those things. The third, from a technology investment, is transparency. And that's really our home base, which is how do I ensure that I have figured out where I'm doing business and where I need to be doing business and what are the alternatives, because I'm going to have to make those choices, and we've seen that the last 2.5 years. The last is collaboration, which goes back to the last point I made, in that you just got educated for 2.5 years that you are hyper-connected and dependent on businesses and countries you had no idea you were doing business in. When Ukraine-Russia crisis broke out, CEOs that were working, our customer CEOs, used our platform to understand if they were doing business with Russia, because you had 3,000 sanctions suddenly. And if you're buying directly from a country and a company, only 11% of the companies in the world actually look at their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, and rarely are they monitoring them. And so getting that collaboration is really important. So when you're talking about advising, you can't keep shrinking, because the hits are going to keep on coming, right? So how do I scenario plan? How do I invest? And how do I do this with both eyes open and better informed decision making through data?
And in looking for those new opportunities, how much of the evolving taste of the consumer is impacting your, the technology that a lot of your clients are harnessing now?
Yeah, I think it's a big thing, because the Amazon effect, for example, every consumer product company is feeling the heat of the Amazon effect, right? So how do they change their business practices? Consumers are evolving. So it's become more and more, to Jennifer's point, the connecting the dots has become very important. It's no longer about just within my enterprise. I have to connect to my consumers and customers digitally very differently, right? If you think of Amazon's advantage has always been they have rich consumer data because everything that you do, they know. And then they're able to tune their supply chain and suppliers to that. But if I'm a big CPG company, I never had that consumer connect. I never had that. So everyone is now realizing, I need to have a much better consumer connect. I need to transform. And to Jennifer's point, it's no longer about within my own four walls. I need to connect to my suppliers and my multi-tier suppliers. So to a broader point, is the recession going to impact? I think whatever the recession or not, companies have realized this is a fundamental shift in operating model capabilities. If they don't do it, they're not going to survive longer term. So we are seeing an acceleration actually in investment in digital capabilities, in transformation capabilities, because it's a must-have capability for the future to survive.
Great, thank you. We've got about 2 minutes left. Jennifer, I'll give you the final word.
So I think that the good news is that technology does exist to solve the problems that we're talking about. And so if anyone here is waiting for things to go back to normal, I would think you would agree this is normal. I think, again, it's technology that's underpinning all of us in a global economy that's created this ripple effect and the collaboration that's needed. And I think, honestly, the good news is technology does exist. We just have to make sure we're investing in the right places based on our industry, our business, our consumer buying patterns, and the employees that we want to attract to work with our companies, because it's a very value-based driven consumer world right now.
That's great. So I think the takeaway for everyone is it doesn't matter what that risk is that you're facing, that looming threat that could be a year, 2 years down the road. It sounds like as long as you have insight into your business, you can make all the right decisions to help you transcend that chaos. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Chakri, for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you.